Hello friends and welcome to Easy Trade Racing, where playtime has never been this easy. In today's video, we received another engine from a customer that says, Ryno, help me! I cannot get it to start. So we are going to unbox it now, see what the problem is, fix that problem, and hopefully you'll learn something. Let's get to it. Okay, so this engine is in pieces. This guy also said that he put a new carb on and it still didn't work. Okay, so I'm gonna need a cloth. There's some oil here. Let me just go fetch one. Alright, nice. So this is a CY 23cc engine. And I am going to teach some of you how I know that. Okay, so first off, if you look on the crankcase here, it's got a CY code there. And at the bottom here, this bracket's in the way now, but it says Chung under there. That's a CY engine. And on the side here, you see the CY codes. So now I'm hoping I can get it bright enough, but if you look on the cylinder, there's a code written that says 2832. There we go. The 28 is the stroke and the 32 is the piston size. Now the piston is a 32 millimeter, which is a 23cc. The stroke is a 28, which is a 23cc. Immediately now, I haven't done anything except clean off the oil here in the front. But I'm just looking inside of that intake port there, and I can already see major scratch marks on that piston. So there is definitely something through there. It did some damage. Alright, so first off that I need to know is, what did the customer experience? So I'm gonna just turn it over. Very good compression, it feels like. But as I said, it does look like there is some damage on the piston. So that makes me want to pull the cylinder off straight away and check that ring. I'm going to take the exhaust off and look into the exhaust port and assess the damage. Alright, so here is why it's got so much compression. I hope I can catch this on camera. There's the compression right there. About 50 mils of fuel. And here is stuff coming out of here. Okay, so there is, looks like a piece of metal. I don't know if the camera will pick that up. Oh my word. This ring is completely shot, completely broken. Or shall I say welded into the piston. How am I going to get some light on this thing? Let me go get some light. Okay, hopefully now with some light we can see there. The ring there is welded to the piston. It almost looks like one piece of metal. There you can see it. And there's shards of ring inside the cylinder. So I'm not going to turn it over anymore. It's just going to cause more damage in the cylinder. Hopefully it can be saved, because these cylinders, the CY cylinders here in South Africa, just the cylinder alone costs about the same as a replacement Roven cylinder and crankcase. Right, let's strip. Okay. The cylinder is shot. I'll have to take a photo and show you. I'll try and put it on the camera now with a torch, but it's gone, it's gone. This is a rebuild. So what you do with this now is you convert it to either a King motor 23cc, but you're going to have to replace the piston and the ring anyway. You can use the crank and everything else, so I would just convert it to either a Roven 29. Look at that beauty. Sandblasted. So the intake has been sandblasted It might still have run with the intake looking like that, but that exhaust port has got a nasty cut. Like, it's probably a 1 mil indent into the cylinder there, and that's not recoverable. This has become a paperweight. This is the intake side, and this is the exhaust side. Oh my word! Can you see why? Can you see what happened? Do you see that dot? Oh, God, I'm dropping this thing now too much. Do you see that dot on top of the piston? There's a little dot. Sometimes there's an arrow. That dot actually shows exhaust port. So now when you hold your engine the right way, the exhaust port, it's facing the wrong way. So what happened? They installed this piston the wrong way around, and there is where your ring gap sits. The ring gap is supposed to be on the intake side, so this ring gap opened up in the exhaust port. So let me show you here. On the intake side, you've got the little piece of metal at the top. That piece of metal sticking out there is meant to keep your ring closed when the piston drops down. Now your exhaust port does not have that, and it cannot keep the ring closed. So if you put your piston the wrong way around, that opening is going to open in the exhaust port, and bam, this is what's going to happen. So this is going to cost the customer, all in all, 30, 60, 65, 75, say it's going to cost the customer $80 for the parts, including my labor. So all in all, maybe $100, and he will have almost a brand new engine. So I'm going to pitch that to him, and if we rebuild this engine, I will still record, I will still put it in this video. But if he says no, just leave it as is for now, we're going to see what we can do in the future, or get second-hand parts from our buy and sell groups and so on, then this will be the end of the video. Alright, customer have decided to go with a 29cc. So that's what I'm going to build him. I will show you how I build it now. But first, lunchtime.
Oh, and there, it's nice and peaceful.
Right, let's convert this motor. The first thing I got to do is get these flywheel and this clutch off. I'm just going to use my clutch holding tool here. All you do is you put this over the clutch, which is quite tight on this CY clutch, and then the flywheel is going to turn on this side, is going to turn right, and then that holds the clutch so I can loosen the flywheel. Alright dudes, so what do we have here? Why did I recommend a 29cc to this customer? So firstly, this is his old crankcase, 2 bolts holding the cylinder down. This is the new crankcase, 4 bolts holding the cylinder down. Now this is the same crankcase for a 23, 26, 29 and a 30.5. This is a small block crankcase. So now the crank that we want to use is his old one, which is a 28mm stroke. So even though the 29cc and the 30.5 uses the same size piston, which is a 36mm piston, the 30cc stroke is longer. So this is a 29cc. On a 30cc, that pin would be 1mm further out. So as it has a longer stroke, the cylinder is longer, 2mm longer than the 29cc. So what do I have here? I've got a Rovan 29cc and a King Motor 29cc. So in a minute I'm going to use my little tool here, this thing, will measure my squish. So as the piston pushes up on it, it is very, very sensitive. So it will tell me if there's a 1 millimeter gap or a 0.5 millimeter gap or a 0.2 millimeter gap. I'm going to assemble and then show you how I do those tests, see which cylinder we're going to pick. There is a difference. This Rovan cylinder is cheaper than the King motor. Right, so what I'm doing now is screwing this thing down as far as it will go. Disclaimer, I have had no formal training with this thing. This is just the way I do it. And I'm not 100% sure if that's even the correct way to do it. So then I push the piston all the way to the top until it can't go anymore, and then I loosen this thing on the side and I turn the dial until it's on 0. Once it's on 0, I just make sure I let go of the piston and I push it again just to make sure I get a more or less accurate reading. It's not going to be perfect ever, but it almost hits 0 every single time. Then I tighten that 0 measurement there, so now it can't move. That's 0. Now what I do is I install the piston on the crank. Okay, I got to cut that off. I'm going to do that now. Install the piston on the crank, bolt that down without a ring onto here, and then it's going to tell me what the gap is between the piston and the top dead center. Right, now without a ring, I stick this on top and then we bolt it down. So not super tight, just hand tight like that, nice and flush. So now if we look at the dial, when I turn the engine over, it touches the dial and makes it move. So you will see when it stops, so I've got no clue what that means, because that kind of like goes past my 0 point. See, so there that's top dead center, that's the max. If I turn it more, it drops again. You know what I should have done? I'm going to look back on my footage quickly, but I should have looked at that number there. So currently we're on just over 6. So that is 6.2. So I'm going to look at my previous video quickly and see where was 0 when I pushed the piston into the cylinder, because maybe 0 was 7.2. Then that means there's a millimeter squish, a millimeter gap up there, which is huge. Okay, so I went back on my footage and it was on 6. So the 0 when I pushed it by hand was on 6. So now I think with this crank pushes further or higher than what I could with my finger. It's basically hitting the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it off and try to push it with my hand again, not move any dials here, and then see if we get the same. That's just bizarre. Okay, piston off the crank. I'm going to put it the right way, arrow pointing towards the exhaust port. Putting my finger in there, it starts on 0, the small dial. You see that small one? It starts on 0. Pushing it up with my finger. You see. So the piston direction I think also makes a big difference. I didn't have the same direction, but look there. That's now as high as I can push it. That means that this cylinder on there with that crank is hitting top dead center. So if I put a paper gasket now and squash it down with the bolts, that paper gasket will squish down to 0.2 of a millimeter. That means the squish on this 29cc will be 0.2 of a millimeter. That is brilliant. That is very, very good. So I'm going to assemble it with a paper gasket, and I think this thing is going to pull very, very strong. Alright, this engine has been converted to a 29cc. I used, on the CY engine, I used the clutch mount, the clutch housing, the intake manifold, the flywheel, the coil, spark plug. And there you have it, 29cc. Next up, I'm just going to put the fan cover on, the cylinder cover on, and then we're going to fire it up and see how she sounds. Rightio, it is the next morning because I finished with this thing late last night. I obviously got other responsibilities as well. This being one of them. I don't know if you can see it. What do you want? You want to come try and see what this is? Come. Anyway, so I had to strip off carbs. The customer sent 3 carbs with this carb. The one was disassembled. It's in pieces. And then the one carb that looked like the one that was on the engine last, that one just flooded the engine. That's like obviously why all that fuel came out of the engine when I stripped it. So this carb has got a jet issue. It's just flooding the engine. It needs a refurb. The other carb, I could not get it primed at all even. So I couldn't get fuel in the carb. I couldn't get it started. So I went to fetch my carb, well, one of my carbs. And I currently have a Walbro 1191 on it. And I just gave it a quick yank last night and it started straight up. So I got it started with the customer's carb. It started and then it died, obviously flooding it. There was just fuel coming out of this air filter like big time. So I couldn't get it started again, it was flooded. I put my carb on, one yank, there we go. So this is the carb once again. I'm gonna just start it from a cold start. It is ice cold. This coil plug has a small hole in it, so that thing choked me last night like crazy. My arm went stiff. But anyway, so let's give it a bash. Start it up, just let it idle nice and warm, and then I know that this thing will make the customer happy. He is gonna have to refurb his carb or possibly buy another one. I will tell him about it this morning. It's just still very early, and yeah, let's give it a bash. I just wanted to show you that the engine is running. When you start an engine like this, raw, outside of the Baja, outside of any mounting plates, you must be very, very careful. I have learned my lessons, and the biggest thing is this flywheel at the back. That thing's open because I don't have the cylinder cover on here. So if you hold this thing wrong and you try and start it, that flywheel will chop your finger off. The second thing is this clutch. This clutch is open, there's no bell on it, so you cannot rev up the engine. I'll just let it idle like that to make sure that it's running and stuff. The customer can rev it once he's got it mounted in his car. But if you rev this engine just like this, with no clutch bell, this clutch will overextend. It will maybe snap the spring, but if you don't snap the spring, it will stretch that spring and it will be of no use anymore. It will kick in way too early, it will be useless, it will maybe fall out when it is assembled into the car. So never ever rev it open like this without a clutch bell mounted on it, and always be careful with your fingers inside these cavities, you know. So I think very carefully before I move my hands when I hold this car to show you it idling. So it's still pretty rich. It's obviously going to get another carburetor, so I'm not going to set my carburetor according to this thing's settings, but engine is running. I'm happy. Right, this engine build is finally complete, and as you can see, it's got a few new parts on it. The customer opted for a brand new carburetor, clutch, and pull start. Basically, this engine now is brand new with a CY crank. This thing is gonna move. I have very high hopes for this engine. If you want to know the parts that I use to build this engine, I would list them now, and you can build your own if you want, or send it to a specialist. Alright guys, that's it from me. This is Easy Trade Racing. Playtime has never been this easy.